Life on the distant planet was never easy. From the moment the first humans set foot on its rocky surface, it became clear that survival here would demand more than courage. It would demand everything they had. The planet was harsh, unforgiving, and strange, unlike anything they had experienced on Earth. The ground was jagged and uneven, stretching for miles in sharp ridges and cliffs, while storms rolled across the horizon with frightening speed, bringing winds that could rip through shelters and heavy rains that could flood the valleys in minutes. Even the sun seemed different here, harsher, burning brighter, scorching the surface during the day, while at night the temperatures plummeted to near freezing, leaving no time for rest or comfort. Every day was a fight just to exist, and the people of the colony quickly realized that their lives would be measured in the small victories of surviving one more day. The colony itself was small, made up of basic shelters, research labs, and storage facilities hastily built from whatever materials the settlers could transport or fabricate on site. Life here lacked luxury. Electricity was limited, water had to be carefully collected and purified, and food was always a careful calculation. Crops had been planted in small greenhouses, but the soil was poor and strange diseases attacked the plants, leaving the settlers constantly searching for ways to feed themselves. Hunting the local fauna brought its own dangers, because the animals were aggressive, often larger than expected, and not afraid to attack humans. The colonists quickly learned that their survival required constant vigilance and innovation. Each person had a role. Engineers repaired broken machinery, medics treated injuries that would have been minor on Earth but could turn fatal here, and farmers experimented with ways to grow food in the alien soil. Yet, no matter how hard they worked, the planet always seemed one step ahead, as if it was determined to test their resolve at every turn. Families and individuals alike felt the weight of isolation. Communication with Earth was slow, unreliable, and often delayed by weeks. Messages from home were rare, and responses to their pleas for assistance could take months, sometimes longer. The colonists began to understand that they could not depend on anyone but themselves. They had left behind a world of familiarity, but in exchange, they faced a world where the rules of survival were harsh and unyielding. Children were taught to grow up quickly, learning from their parents how to navigate dangerous terrain, identify edible plants, and avoid the planet's more aggressive wildlife. There was little room for play or frivolity. Each day was consumed by the work of keeping everyone alive. Yet, despite this, bonds formed among the settlers that were deeper than anything they had known on Earth. The shared struggle created a community where people relied on one another completely. Friends became family, and every act of kindness, sharing food, repairing someone's shelter, or helping a neighbor in danger carried immense meaning. The dangers they faced were constant reminders that life here was fragile. Electrical storms swept across the skies, sometimes igniting fires or causing power failures that disrupted vital systems. Tremors and minor quakes shook the ground without warning, threatening to collapse the shelters or bury the crops. Predatory creatures roamed near the colony, always on the lookout for an easy meal, and even the smaller wildlife could carry diseases unknown on Earth. Illness was a constant threat. A simple infection could become deadly when medical supplies were limited and doctors had to improvise treatments. Every member of the colony had a story of survival, of narrowly escaping disaster, of enduring a night where the wind howled so fiercely it seemed the world itself was collapsing. These stories were told and retold, not as entertainment, but as warnings and lessons, each tale reinforcing the reality of their precarious existence. Despite these hardships, there was a quiet determination that ran through the colony. People had come here with the hope of exploration, of discovery, and of building something new. Some were scientists seeking knowledge about the planet's unique flora and fauna. Others were engineers and builders hoping to expand human presence into new worlds. And yet, all of them were united by the need to survive, to endure whatever the planet threw at them, and to support each other through the relentless challenges. Every day brought new obstacles, and every obstacle required new solutions. They built irrigation systems for their crops, reinforced shelters against storms, and created traps to protect themselves from predators. Over time, small improvements made life marginally easier, but the underlying danger never disappeared. The colonists learned quickly that any sense of security was temporary and fragile, and that complacency could be fatal. As the seasons passed, hope became a delicate balance with realism. They knew that help from Earth was uncertain, resupply ships were rare, and there were no guarantees that their messages would reach the right people. Yet, hope remained because the alternative, complete surrender to despair, was unacceptable. They celebrated small successes with genuine joy, whether it was a healthy crop harvest, the repair of a critical piece of equipment, or simply making it through a violent storm without injury or loss. These moments of triumph, however brief, reminded them that they were not entirely powerless, that human ingenuity and determination could still find a foothold, even in the most hostile of worlds. The psychological toll was immense. Loneliness, fear, and the constant stress of survival weighed on every colonist. Dreams of Earth, the familiar landscapes, the friends and family left behind, and the comforts of home haunted them. Some found solace in memories, others in the routines of work, and still others in companionship with their fellow settlers. Communities held meetings, shared stories, and supported each other through moments of doubt and despair. Rituals evolved, small celebrations of life that helped maintain morale and reminded everyone that their existence had value beyond mere survival. Each colonist carried not just the burden of their own life, but the lives of their neighbors as well. Knowing that the strength of the community determined the strength of the individual, it was in this harsh environment that the foundation of their collective character was forged. They became resilient, inventive, and resourceful out of necessity. The planet tested their limits, stripping away pretense and comfort, forcing them to confront fear, pain, and uncertainty daily. But in this struggle, they discovered the depths of human endurance. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. They understood that success was measured not by conquest of the planet, but by the ability to persist, to adapt, and to care for one another in a world that seemed designed to challenge them at every step. This background set the stage for everything that was to come. The colony, hardened by adversity, had become a community capable of extraordinary resilience. But even the strongest and most resourceful people have limits. The challenges they faced were increasing in severity, and the constant pressure of survival weighed heavily on everyone. It was only a matter of time before circumstances would push them to the brink, forcing them to confront the reality that they could not endure alone forever. The planet had tested them, but it had also prepared them, and as the days stretched on, the colony waited, hoping for a sign, a glimmer of aid from the distant world they had left behind, unaware that help would come, but not in the way they imagined. Even as fear and exhaustion gnawed at the colonists, there was an unspoken understanding that life had to go on. They maintained routines, repaired infrastructure, cared for the sick, educated the young, and cultivated hope in subtle ways. This determination became the essence of the colony's identity, a group of humans surviving on the edge of a hostile world, bonded not just by circumstance, but by shared courage and shared dreams of a future where survival was not the only measure of life. And it was this foundation, this unbreakable human spirit, that would set the stage for the extraordinary events that would follow. When help arrived in a form so overwhelming and unexpected that it would forever change the course of their lives. The colony had survived its first few years on the planet, but survival did not mean life was easy. Every day, the settlers faced challenges that tested their strength, intelligence, and patience. The harshness of the environment grew more pronounced with each passing season. What had once been small problems now became serious threats. Water sources were drying up faster than expected, and the purification systems were failing under constant use. Crops struggled to grow in the alien soil, often wilting before reaching maturity, and livestock was dwindling due to disease and predatory attacks. The colonists were clever and hardworking, but the planet seemed to push back with increasing intensity. Every day brought new obstacles, and every obstacle demanded more from the settlers than they sometimes felt able to give. As the colony's difficulties grew, morale began to suffer. People were tired, stressed, and constantly on edge. The younger colonists, who had been born on the planet, did not remember Earth and had never known comfort. They had grown up in a world where storms could destroy their homes overnight and where every meal was uncertain. The older generation, who remembered life on Earth, felt the pangs of nostalgia and grief. They missed the safety, abundance, and familiarity of home. They remembered a time when a sudden storm was inconvenient at worst, when neighbors could visit freely, and when illness rarely meant death. Here, all of that had been stripped away. Every setback, every loss, felt heavier because it reminded the colonists of how isolated they truly were. The challenges did not come one at a time. They came all at once, compounding each other into crises that seemed impossible to manage. A particularly harsh season brought violent storms that damaged the colony's shelter and greenhouses. The settlers worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but they were exhausted, and resources were scarce. Equipment that was designed for efficiency failed under the strain, leaving the colonists scrambling for alternatives. Even simple tasks became monumental efforts. Gathering water became dangerous when storms washed away paths and bridges. Hunting or foraging exposed people to the planet's deadly wildlife. Every decision carried risk, and every mistake could mean injury or death. Slowly, the sense of constant danger began to wear down even the strongest minds. Anxiety became a constant companion, and sleep was often elusive as people lay awake imagining the disasters that could strike while they rested. Amid these challenges, a crucial problem began to dominate everyone's thoughts. Supplies, food, water, and medical equipment were dwindling faster than anticipated. The colony's reserves were intended to last through difficult seasons, but with repeated failures of crops and infrastructure, the resources ran dangerously low. The colonists rationed carefully, but rationing could only do so much. Each day, families worried if they would have enough to eat that night, if the water they drank was truly safe, or if a sick child could receive the treatment they desperately needed. The weight of responsibility pressed on every adult, and the stress sometimes led to arguments, frustration, and fear. Even in the closest knit groups, tension could flare when survival was on the line. Yet no one could give up. Every member of the colony understood that giving in to despair would mean certain death, not just for themselves but for their families and neighbors as well. The colony's leaders were under immense pressure. Decisions had life or death consequences, and there was no margin for error. They had to prioritize what needed attention most urgently: fixing shelters, maintaining water systems, tending crops, or defending the settlement from predators. Sometimes the leaders made decisions that were unpopular, because the needs of the many had to outweigh the needs of the few. They faced criticism and doubt from those they sought to protect. Yet they persevered, often taking on burdens they did not share with anyone else. Leadership here was not about authority. It was about sacrifice, vision, and the unending willingness to act even when the odds were stacked against them. The strain of constant vigilance weighed heavily on these individuals, and their nights were filled with worry over whether their choices would keep the colony alive. As the hardships mounted, the colonists began to consider more desperate measures. The usual channels for help communications with Earth were slow, unreliable, and often fruitless. They had sent messages before, but responses were delayed or incomplete, leaving them with little practical assistance. They realized that if they were to survive, they would need to find a way to make their situation impossible to ignore. The idea of sending a more urgent distress signal took shape. It was not a simple message asking for help. It was a cry from the edge of desperation, a call that spelled out their struggles, their dwindling resources, and the imminent dangers that threatened to wipe out the entire settlement. They drafted the message carefully, making sure every word conveyed the urgency without exaggeration, hoping it would reach the right people who could respond decisively. Meanwhile, life continued in the colony despite the growing threat. Children still learned to navigate the planet, carrying water, helping in greenhouses, and understanding the creatures that roamed nearby. Adults juggled multiple roles: farmer, engineer, medic simultaneously, often without sleep or proper food. Every individual understood that survival was a shared responsibility. If one person failed, everyone could suffer. Over time, this harsh environment fostered innovation. The settlers found ways to reinforce shelters with local materials, improvise irrigation systems, and even use parts of the environment to protect against predators. Their ingenuity grew from necessity, and while the planet was still dangerous, they slowly adapted to its rhythms. Yet no adaptation could eliminate the uncertainty. The colonists lived each day knowing that a single storm, disease, outbreak, or predator attack could undo all their hard work. The mental toll of constant danger and uncertainty began to show in subtle ways. People grew quieter, more reflective, and sometimes withdrawn. Fear became a companion, but so did resilience. The colonists began to measure life in small victories: a repaired shelter, a day without injury, a successful harvest of even a few crops. These moments, though minor in isolation, provided the motivation to keep going. They celebrated quietly, often in shared meals or simple conversations, because they understood that acknowledging success was crucial to maintaining hope. Hope became a lifeline. It was what allowed them to rise each morning, to face the cold nights, the storms, and the ever-present threat of failure. Despite the growing hardships, the colonists did not lose their sense of community. In fact, adversity strengthened it. People helped each other in practical ways, but also emotionally. When someone lost hope, neighbors stepped in with encouragement, reminding them of their shared strengths. Skills were taught to the young, stories of survival were passed down, and the collective memory of what it took to endure became a guide for the present. Even small act, sharing a meal, helping repair a broken shelter, or comforting a frightened child carried immense weight. Every gesture reinforced the understanding that survival was not an individual effort but a communal one. As weeks turned into months, the colony's situation became increasingly desperate. Food shortages grew severe, and some settlers began experiencing the physical effects of malnutrition. Water systems continued to fail, making each day a gamble between quenching thirst and avoiding contamination. Medical emergencies became more critical because the supplies they had left were not enough to treat every illness or injury. Each challenge compounded the others, creating a sense of mounting pressure. Sleep became rarer, and people were constantly on edge, anticipating the next disaster. The planet itself seemed relentless, almost aware of the colony's vulnerabilities, testing them in ways that left them exhausted and uncertain. In the midst of this growing desperation, the leaders made the decision to broadcast the distress signal. They understood the risks. Making their situation known could attract attention from any source, good or bad, yet the risks of inaction were far greater. The message contained everything about the colony's struggles: its dwindling food and water, the dangers posed by wildlife and storms, and the urgent need for assistance. They hoped that whoever received the signal would understand the urgency and respond quickly. It was a gamble, and sending it required courage, faith, and the acknowledgement that survival was no longer possible without external intervention. While the signal transmitted across space, the colony waited anxiously. Every day felt heavier, filled with uncertainty. The colonists continued their work, tending to what they could, improvising repairs, and protecting the settlement. Their focus remained on survival, but now it was accompanied by hope: fragile, uncertain, but real. They clung to the possibility that help could arrive, that the cycle of hardship might finally be broken. Yet, they also knew that hope alone would not save them. It would take courage, ingenuity, and the collective strength of the community to endure until that help arrived. This period of mounting challenges defined the colony. It revealed the limits of human endurance and the power of collective resilience. People who once doubted themselves discovered inner strength. Families grew closer, and leaders emerged who could guide others even under the most extreme pressure. The colony, though strained, became more organized, more resourceful, and more capable of facing the unknown. And while the planet continued to push them to their limits, it also forged a community ready for the next stage of its journey, a stage where help would finally arrive, changing everything in ways they could not yet imagine. The colony had endured countless challenges and had learned to survive on the harsh, unforgiving planet, but no amount of preparation could have readied them for what came next. The storm season had begun with an intensity unlike anything they had seen before. Fierce winds howled across the jagged cliffs, tossing debris and battering their fragile shelters. Torrential rains flooded the valley floors, washing away pathways, collapsing storage units, and damaging the delicate greenhouses where they grew their food. For days, the settlers worked tirelessly to reinforce structures, patch leaks, and prevent disaster. But the storm was relentless, as if the planet itself was testing their limits. Even with all their skills and ingenuity, they realized that survival was no longer just about enduring. It was about holding on against overwhelming odds. The storm brought a series of crises that compounded one another. The water purification system, already under strain, failed entirely during the peak of the flooding. The colony's reserves of clean water dwindled rapidly, and rationing became a daily necessity. Medical emergencies became frequent, as minor injuries turned dangerous in the damp, cold conditions. The storms also drove predatory wildlife closer to the colony, seeking shelter from the wind and rain. And the settlers found themselves defending their homes and loved ones from creatures far more aggressive than they had anticipated. Every day was a battle, and every night brought new fears of what the next morning would reveal. Exhaustion settled over the colony like a heavy blanket, yet there was no option to rest. Survival demanded constant vigilance, and even a moment of carelessness could have deadly consequences. Communication with Earth became nearly impossible during this period. Antennas were damaged, signal amplifiers shorted, and the storm interfered with every attempt to broadcast messages. The colonists grew desperate, realizing that without aid, the storm and its aftermath could wipe out everything they had worked for. They sent every possible signal, repeating the distressed message again and again, hoping that someone, somewhere, would notice their plight and come to their aid. Anxiety reached a fever pitch as hours turned into days with no response. They began to imagine the worst-case scenarios: total destruction, loss of life, and the end of their dreams on this distant world. Fear was everywhere, but so too was determination. They had survived before, and though the storm was fiercer than anything they had faced, they refused to give up. As the crisis deepened, the settlers were forced to make impossible choices. Supplies were so scarce that they had to prioritize who received food and medical treatment. Children and the sick were given what little they had, while the strongest adults took on the heaviest burdens. Families were separated as some ventured out into the storm to repair damaged infrastructure or retrieve vital supplies, risking life and limb in the process. The community was strained to its limits, and tension occasionally erupted into heated arguments. Yet beneath the fear and frustration there was a profound sense of unity. Everyone understood that survival depended not on individual heroics but on collective effort. Even in the midst of chaos, the colony functioned like a living organism, each person playing a role that was crucial to the survival of the whole. It was during one of the worst nights of the storm that the unexpected occurred. A faint, pulsing signal appeared on the colony's damaged communication array. At first, the settlers thought it was a glitch, a trick of the failing equipment. But as they tuned the instruments, the signal grew clearer, carrying a presence and energy they had never experienced. The faint hum evolved into a series of structured waves, a transmission not just from Earth, but from something far more powerful, far more capable. The colony's leaders gathered around the equipment, eyes wide with disbelief. They realized immediately that help was coming, but not in the form they had imagined. It was not a small rescue team, not a few ships dispatched to provide supplies. What arrived next would be something they had only heard about in stories and legends, force known across human space for its strength, resilience, and overwhelming power. The Deathworlders. The first sight of the Deathworlders' arrival was breathtaking. From the storm-darkened skies, massive ships descended with precision and authority. The sheer size of the fleet was staggering. It seemed to blot out the clouds themselves. Lights flashed across the horizon, illuminating the valley in stark, almost surreal brightness. The settlers could hardly believe their eyes. The Deathworlders were renowned for their ability to survive and thrive in conditions far harsher than any ordinary human could endure. They were known as conquerors of the deadliest worlds, survivors of environments that would crush most colonies. To see them arrive in full force was both inspiring and terrifying. Every colonist felt a mixture of fear, hope, and overwhelming curiosity. They were about to witness firsthand the legendary might of the Deathworlders. That as the fleet landed, the Deathworlders wasted no time. Their movements were precise, coordinated, and efficient. Within hours, teams were deployed to assess the colony's needs, fortify structures, and neutralize immediate threats. Their technology was unlike anything the colonists had seen: advanced shielding to protect against storms, automated systems for water purification and food production, and tools that could repair or rebuild damaged shelters almost instantly. The settlers watched in amazement as entire sections of the colony, which had been in danger of collapse, were stabilized and reinforced. It was as if the planet's challenges had met their match, and the presence of the Deathworlders turned a desperate struggle into a manageable situation almost overnight. The impact of the Deathworlders extended beyond the physical. Their arrival also brought psychological relief. The settlers, who had been living in a constant state of fear, now felt a sense of security they had never known. The overwhelming strength of their rescuers reassured them that they would survive, that the storm and the dangers of the planet were no longer insurmountable. Confidence returned slowly, but surely. Families embraced, tears were shed, and for the first time in months, there was laughter, quiet at first, then growing as the realization sank in that they were no longer alone. The presence of the Deathworlders was a turning point, a moment when despair gave way to hope and fear began to be replaced by trust. The Deathworlders' methods, however, were not subtle. They worked with a speed and efficiency that was almost alarming. Where the settlers had been cautious, the Deathworlders were bold. They ventured into dangerous terrain, faced predatory creatures without hesitation, and repaired systems that the colonists had feared were beyond saving. Their approach was intimidating, and some settlers initially hesitated, unsure if they could trust these powerful newcomers. But every action taken by the Deathworlders demonstrated skill, precision, and care. Slowly, trust grew, and the settlers began to see that this overwhelming force was not here to dominate but to save. It was a lesson in power tempered by responsibility, in strength wielded for the benefit of those who needed it most. The storm, which had once seemed unstoppable, began to lose its grip on the colony. With the Deathworlders' advanced technology and strategic planning, flooding was managed, shelters were reinforced, and wildlife threats were neutralized. Every hour brought measurable improvement, and the settlers could almost feel the weight of the crisis lifting from their shoulders. The presence of these extraordinary beings also taught the colonists new ways to survive. They observed, learned, and adapted techniques that had been used on worlds far more dangerous than their own. Even though the storm was still raging, the colony no longer faced it defenseless. Knowledge, strategy, and raw power had entered their world, tipping the scales in their favor. By the time the storm began to subside, the settlers realized that they had been through a transformation. The escalation of danger, the storm, the failing supplies, the constant threat of wildlife had brought them to the brink. But the arrival of the Deathworlders had not only saved them physically, it had also changed their perception of what was possible. They had learned that help could come in forms beyond imagination, that survival was possible even when the odds seemed hopeless, and that courage and perseverance could attract assistance when all seemed lost. This critical moment, when disaster and salvation intersected, marked the turning point in the colony's struggle. The fear and despair that had dominated life for so long were replaced with awe, relief, and cautious optimism. As the last remnants of the storm cleared, the settlers began to survey the changes around them. The damage was being repaired, food systems were being restored, and security measures were being implemented to prevent future crises. Children ran through reinforced pathways, playing in ways they had not dared during the storm. Adults worked alongside the Deathworlders, learning new techniques and adapting to the new systems that had been installed. For the first time, there was a sense of normalcy, though the memory of the near disaster lingered as a reminder of the fragility of life on this harsh planet. The critical moment had passed, but its lessons remained. The colony had faced near annihilation and had survived, not by luck, but through a combination of human endurance and the intervention of an extraordinary force. The events of this period would be remembered forever in the colony's history. Stories of the storm, the struggles, and the arrival of the Deathworlders would be told and retold, becoming legends for future generations. The settlers had learned that life could be harsh and unpredictable, but also that hope could arrive in the most unexpected ways. The escalation of danger and the dramatic intervention had reshaped their understanding of survival, courage, and the power of outside assistance. They had crossed the threshold between despair and salvation, a threshold that marked the true beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The arrival of the Deathworlders changed everything for the colony. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival now transformed into a remarkable period of recovery, rebuilding, and learning. From the moment they landed, the Deathworlders took control of the situation with precision and efficiency. Their actions were deliberate, their strategies calculated, and their understanding of survival on harsh planets unmatched. For the settlers, it was like watching legends move in real-life, creatures and humans so skilled, so confident, and so powerful that they seemed almost invincible. At first, some of the settlers were intimidated by their presence. The Deathworlders worked quickly, with a discipline that left no room for error. Yet, despite their overwhelming power, there was a sense of purpose and care in everything they did, and slowly, the settlers began to realize that they were no longer alone in facing the planet's relentless dangers. The first task that Deathworlders took on was to stabilize the colony itself. The shelters, which had barely survived the storms, were immediately reinforced using advanced materials and techniques the settlers had never seen before. Fragile walls became sturdy, flood-prone areas were protected with barriers, and previously unsafe living quarters were transformed into secure, habitable spaces. Water systems were overhauled with new filtration units capable of handling even the planet's most contaminated sources. Food systems were upgraded, greenhouses were repaired and enhanced, and new methods were introduced to maximize crop growth despite the poor soil and harsh weather. Every part of the colony, from sleeping quarters to storage facilities, was assessed, repaired, and improved. Within days, the settlement that had been on the brink of collapse began to function efficiently, as if a new layer of life had been added to it. Alongside the physical rebuilding, the Deathworlders also addressed the ongoing dangers from the planet's wildlife. Predators that had once terrorized the settlers were neutralized, trapped, or relocated using techniques that were safe and effective. Smaller creatures that carried diseases were controlled, and the settlers were shown how to avoid encounters that could be dangerous. In addition, the Deathworlders mapped the surrounding terrain, identifying safe zones, dangerous areas, and locations that could be used for future expansion. The settlers were amazed by the level of detail and planning. Every step taken by the Deathworlders seemed to anticipate potential problems before they happened. It was not just rebuilding. It was a complete transformation of the colony into a place where survival was not just possible, but sustainable. While the Deathworlders worked tirelessly to rebuild, they also taught the settlers valuable lessons in survival and adaptation. They showed how to reinforce structures in ways that could withstand storms far worse than anything the colony had experienced. They demonstrated advanced farming techniques that increased yield even in poor soil, and shared knowledge about local flora and fauna that made hunting and foraging safer and more efficient. Settlers observed and learned quickly, eager to absorb the knowledge that had been gained through centuries of survival in deadly worlds. Each lesson was practical and immediate, applicable not just to the current crisis, but to every future challenge the colony might face. The presence of the Deathworlders turned the settlers into students of survival, combining human ingenuity with experience honed in extreme conditions. The psychological impact of the Deathworlders' presence was equally profound. The settlers, who had been living in constant fear, now felt a sense of security they had never known. Where anxiety had ruled, confidence began to grow. Adults began to smile and laugh again, and children played more freely without the shadow of danger looming over every step. Hope, which had been fragile and tentative, strengthened into a tangible belief that the colony could endure and even thrive. The settlers began to see themselves not just as victims of the planet, but as capable of controlling their environment, especially with the guidance and assistance of the Deathworlders. This shift in mindset was as important as the physical rebuilding, because survival depended not only on structures and supplies but on the determination and morale of the people living there. Interactions between the settlers and the Deathworlders became a key part of the colony's recovery. At first, there was a gap in understanding. Communication was sometimes difficult, and the settlers were awed by the sheer presence of these powerful beings. But over time, mutual respect developed. The settlers admired the Deathworlders' skills, discipline, and courage, while the Deathworlders appreciated the settlers' resourcefulness, creativity, and courage in facing a hostile world. Cooperation grew as tasks were shared, strategies discussed, and skills exchanged. What had started as a rescue mission gradually became a partnership. The settlers were not passive observers. They actively participated in the recovery, learning from the Deathworlders and applying their knowledge in real. The colony became a place of shared effort, blending human determination with the expertise of the newcomers. As the days turned into weeks, the colony's transformation became more visible. Areas that had been destroyed or threatened by storms were now secure and productive. Food production was back on track, with crops growing faster and more reliably than before. Water systems functioned efficiently, providing clean drinking water for all. The shelters were no longer fragile. They were safe, resilient, and well organized. Even the environment around the colony had changed. The Deathworlders had established safe zones, warning systems, and protective measures that reduced the threat from wildlife and natural disasters. The settlers began to realize that they were no longer at the mercy of the planet. With the Deathworlders' help, they had moved from surviving by luck and improvisation to thriving through knowledge, strategy, and preparation. One of the most remarkable aspects of the recovery was how the Deathworlders balanced speed with teaching. They did not simply fix everything and leave. That showed the settlers how to maintain the improvements and how to respond to future challenges independently. This approach empowered the colony in a way that simple aid could not. Skills were passed on, techniques explained, and systems demonstrated so that even after the Deathworlders left, the settlers would be capable of protecting themselves and sustaining their community. Knowledge became a permanent gift, and the settlers absorbed it with eagerness. recognizing that this was as valuable as any physical improvement to their colony. The settlers also experienced moments of personal growth during this period. Many who had been timid or unsure of themselves found courage and confidence in working alongside the Death. Children learned new skills that would serve them for life, while adults gained insights into advanced problem-solving and adaptation techniques. The challenges that had once seemed insurmountable were now manageable. Thanks to the combination of human determination and the guidance of the Death, each day brought small triumphs, structures, harvested crops, and improved systems that reinforced the settlers' sense of accomplishment and self-reliance. Even the most skeptical individuals began to see that their future on the planet could be secure, and that their lives were no longer defined solely by struggle and fear. The presence of the Deathworlders also brought a sense of order and organization to the colony. Tasks were prioritized, resources allocated efficiently, and systems put in place that allowed the settlers to plan for the long term. Where chaos had once reigned, there was now structure and predictability. This allowed the settlers to think beyond immediate survival and consider growth, expansion, and future exploration. For the first time, they could envision a life where survival was not constant, where their children could grow up without living in perpetual fear, and where the colony could thrive rather than merely endure. The shift in perspective was profound, altering not only the physical landscape but the very spirit of the community. The culmination of this period of recovery was a sense of transformation. The colony had been rescued, yes, but more importantly, it had been reborn. The settlers were stronger, smarter, and more capable than before. Their environment, once a source of near-constant threat, had been made safer and more predictable. The knowledge, skills, and confidence gained during this period would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And though the Deathworlders would eventually depart, the impact of their presence would remain forever. The colony had been through the worst, faced nearly insurmountable challenges, and emerged not just alive, but empowered, ready to face whatever the future held. By the end of this phase, the settlers understood something profound. Survival was not just about enduring, it was about adapting, learning, and growing stronger with each challenge. The Deathworlders had not only saved their lives, they had changed the trajectory of the colony, turning despair into hope and fear into confidence. The lessons learned during this period would guide the community for generations, shaping not only their strategies for survival but also their understanding of courage, resilience, and the power of collective effort. The settlers were no longer simply survivors, they were pioneers, ready to thrive on a planet that had once seemed impossible to conquer. Once the Deathworlders had completed their work, the colony entered a period of reflection and adjustment. The initial chaos, danger, and fear that had defined their lives were replaced by a calm sense of security. Yet the settlers were not content to simply rest. They understood that their survival was no longer just a daily struggle against the harsh planet. They had been given an opportunity to truly thrive, and this realization brought with it both excitement and responsibility. The settlers began to walk through the colony, seeing it with fresh eyes. Structures that had once been fragile and temporary now stood firm and resilient. Greenhouses glowed with healthy plants, water systems ran smoothly, and protective measures ensured that predators and dangerous storms could no longer threaten the settlement as they once had. It was a moment of triumph, but also of contemplation. The settlers felt the weight of what they had endured and the blessing of what they had gained. On the days following the Deathworlders' departure, the colony focused on maintaining the systems and knowledge they had been taught. The settlers realized that the skills they had learned were now the backbone of their future. They practiced techniques for reinforcing shelters, managing crops, and purifying water. Children and young adults were trained in ways that allowed them to contribute to the safety and growth of the colony, learning survival strategies that would serve them throughout their lives. The elders, who had once been burdened with constant worry, began to see the possibilities of long-term planning. They could now envision a community that not only survived but thrived, where resources could be managed wisely and the next generation could grow up without the constant threat of disaster. The experience had shifted their entire perspective on life, transforming fear and uncertainty into knowledge, strategy, and hope. The psychological effects of this transformation were profound. Many settlers felt a mixture of awe and gratitude, understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Deathworlders' arrival had been overwhelming, almost unbelievable. Yet it had changed the course of their lives completely. The settlers who had been consumed by despair now felt empowered, confident, and capable. They began to rebuild not just their colony, but their sense of self. Individuals who had doubted their abilities discovered hidden strengths. Families grew closer, and friendships were deepened by shared experiences of survival, rescue, and renewal. The community as a whole felt a renewed sense of purpose, and a collective understanding emerged. They were capable of extraordinary things, especially when they worked together. The settlers also began to reflect on the lessons of humility and resilience. The planet had tested them relentlessly, and the near collapse of the colony had been a sobering reminder of human vulnerability. Yet the intervention of the Deathworlders had shown them that no matter how dire circumstances seemed, solutions could arrive in unexpected ways. This awareness did not make them complacent. Rather, it inspired them to prepare for the future with careful planning, adaptability, and a willingness to face challenges with courage. They learned that strength alone was not enough. It had to be combined with knowledge, strategy, and collaboration. The memory of the crisis and the overwhelming assistance they received became a source of wisdom, a story that would guide them through all future hardships. Community traditions began to take shape around these experiences. Settlers established rituals of remembrance and celebration, marking the day of the Deathworlders' arrival as a turning point in their history. They told stories of the terrifying storm, the desperate struggle for survival, and the awe-inspiring intervention that had saved them. These stories were told and retold, growing into legends that inspired hope and courage in all who heard them. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted the events, learning lessons about bravery, teamwork, and the importance of perseverance. The colony's culture began to reflect these values, embedding the idea that even in the most desperate circumstances, human ingenuity, cooperation, and external support could change the outcome of events. This collective memory became a guiding force, shaping how the settlers approached future challenges as the colony stabilized. The settlers began to explore the surrounding areas with renewed confidence. What had once been dangerous terrain became manageable, thanks to the guidance and strategies shared by the Death. They identified areas suitable for expansion, places where additional resources could be harvested, and safe zones where future emergencies could be managed effectively. Exploration, which had previously been a risky necessity, now became a controlled and purposeful activity. The settlers began to map their world more thoroughly, creating detailed records of the landscape, wildlife, and weather patterns. Knowledge that had been fragmented or speculative became concrete and actionable. The colony's ability to survive and adapt was no longer reactive but proactive. Economically, the colony began to think about sustainability and growth. Previously, resources were scarce, and survival had required rationing and improvisation. Now, with the systems introduced by the Deathworlders, the settlers had the opportunity to plan for long-term prosperity. Food production was sufficient to feed the community and store surplus for future needs. Water systems could handle increased demand. Shelters and infrastructure were resilient and capable of expansion. This allowed the settlers to shift their focus from immediate survival to planning for the future. They began to envision a colony that could support new arrivals, expand into nearby areas, and become a permanent settlement capable of thriving on the planet. The possibilities were endless, and this new perspective gave the settlers a sense of excitement and purpose that had been absent for many years. The relationship between the settlers and the Death, though brief, left lasting impressions. Settlers remembered the courage, efficiency, and skills of their rescuers. They reflected on the lessons learned about strategy, teamwork, and the importance of preparation. These insights were not abstract. They were practical and directly applicable to life on the planet. The settlers realized that survival depended on both human ingenuity and the ability to seek and accept help when needed. They had learned that humility, courage, and collaboration were just as vital as strength and endurance. These realizations shaped the colony's culture and mindset, creating a community that was resilient, innovative, and prepared to face any challenge with confidence. Over time, the settlers noticed changes in their own behavior and attitudes. They were calmer in the face of danger, more confident in their abilities, and more willing to take calculated risks. Problem-solving became a collaborative effort, with people sharing ideas, testing solutions, and learning from mistakes without fear of blame. The crisis had forced them to grow quickly, but the arrival of the Deathworlders had shown them that growth could be accelerated through guidance, support, and shared knowledge. They began to see themselves as capable stewards of their environment, responsible not just for surviving, but for shaping their world in a positive and sustainable way. The experience also reinforced the value of community and interdependence. Individuals who had once focused solely on their own survival now understood that the strength of the group was the ultimate measure of resilience. They helped each other more readily, shared resources without hesitation, and worked together to implement the improvements introduced by the Deathworld. Every member of the colony had a role to play, and everyone recognized the importance of their contribution. The shared sense of purpose strengthened bonds between families, friends, and neighbors, creating a community that was not only functional but deeply connected. The settlers had learned that survival alone was not enough. Thriving required cooperation, trust, and a shared vision for the future. As months passed, the colony began to attract attention from neighboring settlements and explorers. News of the Deathworlders' intervention and the colony's transformation spread, inspiring other communities to adopt similar strategies for survival and growth. The settlers became teachers and mentors, sharing the knowledge they had gained and demonstrating the techniques that had allowed them to thrive. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival evolved into a story of resilience, learning, and empowerment. The colony became a symbol of hope and possibility, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the impact of extraordinary assistance in times of crisis. The settlers also took time to honor and remember those who had struggled and sacrificed during the hardest times. Families shared stories of loved ones who had endured incredible hardships, and the community created traditions to ensure that their experiences would not be forgotten. This practice reinforced the lessons learned and provided a sense of continuity and identity for future generations. Children grew up understanding both the dangers of their world and the strengths of their community. They learned that courage, adaptability, and cooperation were vital qualities, and that help could arrive from unexpected places, changing the course of their lives in profound ways. Finally, the colony began to look forward with optimism. The immediate dangers had been addressed, survival was secured, and systems were in place to manage future crises. The settlers could now focus on long-term growth, education, exploration, and the creation of a thriving community. They had faced unimaginable challenges, endured fear and scarcity, and witnessed the arrival of a force that had saved them from disaster. But most importantly, they had learned lessons that would last for generations. They understood the value of preparation, the strength of community, the importance of learning, and the potential for hope to arrive even in the darkest of times. The crisis had ended, but the transformation it initiated would shape the colony forever in the end. The settlers knew that life would always have challenges, and the planet would remain a difficult place to inhabit, yet they no longer feared the unknown. The experiences of survival, escalation, and extraordinary intervention had given them the skills, confidence, and resilience to face whatever came next. They were no longer just survivors, they were pioneers, empowered, prepared, and ready to thrive in a world that had once seemed impossible. And as they looked to the horizon, they carried with them a profound understanding that human courage and cooperation, combined with the guidance of extraordinary allies, could overcome even the most daunting challenges, and that hope, when seized and nurtured, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities.